What's worse than facing a medieval army in battle? Surviving it. The fate of wounded soldiers reveals the brutal reality of medieval society that most people never learn about. Some found salvation. Others discovered hell on earth because their biggest enemy wasn't on the battlefield, it was waiting for them afterward. Getting hurt in medieval battle meant your survival depended on tools that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. Knives, bone saws, iron probes, and red-hot fire became the difference between life and death. Medieval surgery was basically blacksmithing, except the metal being shaped was your body. Medieval surgeons worked with whatever sharp objects they could find lying around. Fire served as their favorite healing tool because heated metal could stop bleeding fast. They'd press glowing iron against open wounds until the flesh sizzled shut like bacon. The smell was unforgettable. But here's where things get interesting about medieval medical understanding. Boiled wine became their go-to antiseptic, though they had no clue why it worked better than regular water. Medieval people thought disease came from bad air or angry spirits, not tiny invisible creatures. Then came the real fun part that wounded soldiers dreaded most. Arrow removal was like the world's worst fishing expedition ever attempted. Those iron hooks and forceps weren't designed for gentle extraction whatsoever. Surgeons went hunting for arrowheads like they were digging for buried treasure, except the treasure chest was your rib cage. Meanwhile, moss became emergency bandages when nothing else was available in the field. This actually wasn't as crazy as it sounds to modern ears. Moss has natural antibacterial properties that medieval healers discovered by accident. Of course, no medieval medical treatment was complete without the famous bloodletting procedure. Feeling feverish? Time to drain some blood immediately? Wound getting infected? More bloodletting was always the answer. Their solution to too much blood was always less blood, like trying to fix a flood by removing the dam. Head injuries received special attention through a technique called trepanation that sounds terrifying today. Doctors would drill holes directly into skulls to relieve pressure on the brain, with primitive tools that barely worked, while patients remained conscious throughout the entire procedure. At least herbal medicine offered some genuine hope for wounded soldiers seeking relief. Plants like comfrey, yarrow, and plantain actually do help wounds heal faster than nothing. Medieval healers didn't understand the science behind it, but they knew what worked. When injuries proved too severe for any treatment available, amputation became the only option left. No pain medication existed anywhere in their world. Just sharp saws and prayers that patients would pass out quickly. The closest thing to anesthesia was a wooden stick to bite down on and hope for the best. Most soldiers who survived the cutting died within 3 to 5 days anyway from complications. Infection was the real killer stalking medieval battlefields constantly. Without understanding germs or sterilization, even small cuts could turn deadly. Yet not everyone was allowed to wield these life-saving tools. Surgery in medieval times wasn't a free-for-all where anyone could grab a knife and start cutting people open. Strict rules controlled who could legally slice into human flesh without facing serious consequences. Barber surgeons held official licenses to perform medical procedures on wounded soldiers and civilians alike. These weren't your friendly neighborhood hairstylists who just trim beards for coins. The same person who trimmed beards would also amputate limbs and stitch up sword wounds. One minute they were giving you a shave. The next minute they were removing your leg. Talk about full-service grooming. Meanwhile, military surgeons traveled with armies during campaigns, but they were rarer than honest tax collectors. Most kingdoms had maybe a handful of trained surgical professionals for their entire military force. Monks took a completely different approach to healing wounded soldiers and sick civilians. Religious rules prevented them from spilling blood, which meant no surgery allowed under any circumstances. Instead, they focused on herbal remedies and praying over wounded soldiers with devotion. But women faced the most complicated restrictions of all when it came to medical practice. Midwives possessed extensive medical knowledge from years of delivering babies and treating sick families. However, treating wounded soldiers put them in dangerous territory where witchcraft accusations could lead to death. Then there were the peasant soldiers who had the worst luck imaginable on medieval battlefields. Elite warriors received care from private attendants who knew basic medical procedures. Common foot soldiers, they relied on fellow troops for makeshift medical help using whatever was available. Your battlefield surgeon was probably the same guy who shared his moldy bread with you the night before. Guild systems in major towns regulated medical practice like exclusive country clubs with strict membership requirements. You couldn't call yourself a surgeon without proper approval from established guild masters. Medical education happened through apprenticeship programs, not formal schools. Rural women often possessed the deepest knowledge about healing herbs and traditional remedies passed down through generations. Generations of medical wisdom passed from mothers to daughters through careful observation. Unfortunately, witchcraft paranoia made their expertise legally dangerous to use publicly without facing accusations. Social class determined everything about medical treatment quality in medieval society without any exceptions. Noble warriors received professional care from trained experts with proper tools. Common soldiers got help from whoever happened to be available. The difference between rich and poor medical care was like comparing a royal feast to scraps from the stable. The cruel irony was obvious to anyone paying attention to medieval society. Those who knew the most about healing were often forbidden from helping those who needed it most, which raises the next logical question. Finding proper medical care after battle was like hunting for a decent hotel during the apocalypse. Most places simply didn't want bloody, screaming soldiers messing up their property or frightening customers. Churches became emergency hospitals whether they wanted to or not according to religious law. Religious duty demanded that they help suffering people even when they lacked medical supplies. Wounded fighters were dragged into sanctuaries, their blood mixing with holy water on stone floors. Nothing says sacred space quite like turning your altar into an operating table. Barns offered practical shelter when better options weren't available anywhere in the surrounding area. At least they stayed dry and blocked the wind from making wounds worse. Unfortunately, injured men ended up lying on straw that hadn't been changed in months. Moreover, manorial halls sometimes opened their doors to wounded fighters who had served faithfully. Lords had obligations to men who'd served them faithfully in previous battles. Space remained limited, though, and resources were always scarce during wartime. Priority treatment went to valuable knights, not expendable foot soldiers. Monasteries with dedicated infirmaries provided the highest quality care available anywhere in medieval Europe. Monks had real experience treating illness and injury through years of practice. Their medical facilities were clean, well-organized, and staffed by people who genuinely cared about healing. Nevertheless, dedicated hospitals existed in some major cities, though they remained rare and constantly overcrowded. Places like St. Bartholomew's in London treated hundreds of patients using medieval resources designed for dozens. Running a medieval hospital was like trying to serve Christmas dinner to the entire village with one chicken and a turnip. Towns near battlefields often refused entry to wounded soldiers completely, barring their gates against desperate men. Fear of disease motivated this harsh cruelty more than anything else in their decision-making process. Town councils worried that infected fighters would spread deadly sickness to local populations. Most wounded soldiers simply ended up on straw mats in whatever shelter could be found quickly. Clean bedding was an expensive luxury that few could afford during wartime. Injured men lay right next to others with festering infections, sharing contaminated air. Additionally, sanitation was practically non-existent in most medical facilities throughout the medieval world. Basic washing facilities were either primitive or completely absent from treatment areas. Environmental conditions made recovery chances even worse than they already were for wounded soldiers. Cold weather slowed healing processes significantly. Summer brought swarms of flies that fed on open wounds. Rats spread disease throughout any enclosed space where people gather for treatment. Yet the physical wounds were only part of the complete story. Medieval soldiers returned home carrying more than just scars and missing body parts from battles. They brought back nightmares, sudden violent outbursts, and emotional numbness that nobody could explain or treat. Today, we understand this condition as PTSD and have developed treatments for it. Back then, people considered it weakness, moral failure, or demonic possession sent from hell. The medieval approach to mental health was basically pointing at troubled veterans and declaring them either cowards or possessed by demons. Veterans came back completely transformed into different people than they had been before war. They'd wake up screaming from nightmares about battles that had ended months earlier. Unexpected noises would trigger violent reactions that terrified their families. They couldn't connect emotionally with family members who had no understanding. Some warriors became hermits, abandoning normal social life entirely to live alone in forests. They'd walk alone to distant holy sites, hoping religious pilgrimage would wash away their mental anguish. These spiritual journeys could take years to complete, and many never returned home. Others joined monasteries not from genuine religious calling, but from desperate need to escape war memories. Monastic life provided structured daily routines and isolation from the outside world. Medieval monasteries accidentally became the world's first mental health retreats, complete with mandatory prayer therapy. Religious confession offered the only socially acceptable way to process overwhelming guilt and fear from warfare. Veterans would tell priests about terrible things they'd witnessed and done during battle campaigns. Some found genuine relief through this spiritual release, while others found talking made worse. But chronic fear and jumpiness earned mockery rather than sympathy from their home communities. Fellow villagers would laugh at veterans who dove for cover when dogs barked loudly. What looked like obvious cowardice was actually damaged minds trying to protect themselves. Families often hid mentally unstable relatives from public view to avoid shame and social consequences. Men who'd once been respected warriors were chained in basements when their behavior became unpredictable. Medieval family therapy involved chains, locks, and hoping the neighbors wouldn't ask questions. No institutions existed anywhere for long-term mental health care in the medieval world. Society had absolutely no framework for understanding or treating psychological trauma beyond prayer. Furthermore, legal systems provided zero recognition of mental trauma as a legitimate war consequence anywhere. A missing hand was visible and might earn sympathy from judges. A broken mind remained invisible and was typically ignored by everyone. The fortunate few eventually discovered ways to manage their invisible wounds through time and effort. But what happened to those whose visible injuries still allowed them to work? Not every wounded soldier became a beggar or social outcast after returning from war campaigns. Some managed to rebuild useful, productive lives despite their permanent physical injuries and ongoing pain. Amputees with strong remaining limbs could still handle farm work using wooden crutches or carved prosthetic legs. Lords constantly needed loyal, experienced men to guard their estates against bandits and rivals. A one-legged guard was still more reliable than a two-legged stranger who might run off with the silver. Wooden prosthetics became surprisingly common for veterans who could afford the craftsmanship and skilled woodworking. Skilled woodworkers carved replacement limbs from sturdy oak or pine, attaching them with leather straps. Walking was possible with practice. Running was definitely not an option for amputees. Village councils sometimes provided food and temporary lodging for well-known local veterans who had served. Community reputation mattered enormously in medieval society where everyone knew each other. A soldier who protected the area before marching off to war could reasonably expect support. Certain monarchs offered small pensions to long-serving or severely wounded fighters who had proven loyalty. These payments were modest but could mean the difference between survival and starvation during winters. Meanwhile, veterans with minor injuries often found steady work in grain mills, as gatekeepers or collectors. These jobs required less physical ability, but still contributed meaningfully to local economic activity. Medieval society was surprisingly good at finding jobs that matched what body parts you had left. High-ranking veterans received access to the finest prosthetic care available anywhere in their kingdom. Master craftsmen created elaborate metal arm braces and sophisticated leg replacements for wealthy clients. These devices were more about maintaining social status than actual function, but they worked enough. Some scarred veterans worked as military instructors, teaching combat techniques to eager new recruits in camps. Their obvious injuries served as proof of real battlefield experience that couldn't be faked. Nothing said, "Listen to me," quite like a missing finger and a collection of sword scars. Mercenary companies often retained injured veterans in various support roles that didn't require active fighting. Men who couldn't fight effectively anymore could still handle supply management or sentry duties reliably. Their military experience remained valuable even when their bodies were permanently broken and couldn't heal. Plus, veterans with visible wounds sometimes earned genuine respect rather than pity, especially when they contributed. Battle scars told compelling stories of courage and survival against impossible odds. However, not every wounded veteran enjoyed such fortunate circumstances. For every veteran who found meaningful work after being wounded, Several others simply vanished into society's darkest shadows. Severe disfigurement and permanent disability could instantly transform yesterday's heroes into today's outcasts without warning. Facial injuries created especially difficult social problems for returning veterans trying to reintegrate into their communities. Medieval people firmly believed that outer physical appearance directly reflected inner moral character and spiritual health. A mangled face was basically a medieval scarlet letter, except instead of adultery, it supposedly revealed all your battlefield sins. Families sometimes rejected their own returning soldiers when wounds were too disturbing to look at. Veterans who couldn't work became crushing financial burdens that desperately poor families simply couldn't support during seasons. Love and loyalty had practical limits when basic survival was constantly at stake. Cities began passing restrictive laws against public begging by ex-soldiers who made streets look dangerous. Too many wounded veterans on busy streets made towns appear dangerous and economically depressed to visitors. Local officials worried that visible human suffering would hurt business profits and drive away merchants. Veterans without strong family connections inevitably became wandering drifters and desperate outlaws seeking any means of survival. Medieval society was built entirely around kinship networks and established local relationships that lasted for generations. When you had no family and no connections, your career options were basically beggar, bandit, or corpse. Some wounded veterans were recruited into foreign armies as completely expendable troops for dangerous missions. Mercenary companies knew that desperate, hungry men would accept extremely dangerous assignments in exchange for food. These soldiers were considered disposable assets from the very beginning of their service. Religious superstition made daily life much harder for veterans with wounds that refused to heal properly. Chronic open sores and permanent disabilities were widely interpreted as divine punishment for terrible sins committed. Medieval people looked at infected wounds and thought, "God's angry," instead of "needs antibiotics." Town records from this period mention mutilated veterans being forcibly expelled from festivals and public celebrations. Their disturbing presence reminded happy people about war's true costs when communities wanted to forget. Nothing killed a festive mood quite like encountering a man with no nose. Disease, completely untreated injuries, and brutal winter weather killed many forgotten veterans within just a few years. Without proper medical attention or adequate shelter, minor health problems quickly became fatal conditions. Some desperate veterans tried disguising themselves as religious pilgrims to gain access to charitable support systems. But obviously wounded ex-soldiers were usually identified and turned away unless they could prove purposes. The disguises rarely worked for long periods, and failure meant starvation or worse. The contrast was both stark and deeply cruel throughout medieval society without any exceptions. Medieval society enthusiastically praised brave warriors and celebrated glorious military victories, but completely abandoned the broken men.